questions. Can we do the lights down a little bit, please? Cool. So anyways, cameras, huh? Okay. Let's talk about, so how did you first get into photography?
When I was 15, I had a friend whose father had a friend who had a darkroom set up in a basement. So we went over to... okay, all right. So we went over to check out what was going on and went down into this basement where he had built a room special for this darkroom. And I was smitten. It was a room with an environment all of its own. It had this red glow. It had a smell to its own. And magic happened in there. Images just appeared from nowhere, it seemed. Both of us went out and figured out how to buy cameras, and I set up a darkroom in my walk-in closet at home. And it was from then on that I was interested in photography. It was a moment, I think, in the United States where 35 millimeter photography was sort of in an explosive point. Everybody seemed to have a camera. And I can remember my mother buying me this set of Time Life books on photography that would come out once a month. And through this great book, I learned technique, and it also introduced you to fine art photographers, Ansel Adams and Imogen Cunningham, Minor White, just the gamut.
So you went to what, Columbia College?
I went to a state school for a year, and then in downtown Chicago there was a fine arts school called Columbia College. It was unaccredited back then and was in a warehouse on Lakeshore Drive, and I went there part-time, and it was just a school where you went and you turned your images upside down and talked about composition. Great moment.
Yeah. So, I mean, you were immediately processing your own work, though?
Yeah, when I was 15, I had the darkroom set up.
Okay. And what were you shooting?
Who can remember? It's ancient history.
Right. Okay. So you went there, and so, I mean, did you ever think about photojournalism? Did you ever think about documentary photography, or were you kind of on your track pretty early, do you think?
I think I was of a generation that I didn't think about my future.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think the future even existed. I was just living my life. Even when I went to Columbia College, I had no plan.
Okay.
Other than heading west, which is what I did.
Eventually. But then, okay, so you went west, and then eventually you ended up south. So
I ended up south.
Origin stories, how did you get to Key West?
I came to Key West in the early 70s. My mother and father had retired, sort of semi-retired down here. I summered for a few years, and then in 1978 moved here permanently. I was lucky enough to land a job running the bookmobile for the county library.
Okay, we're going with our first slide now.
And I have to sort of say I was blessed with this job. I mean, what other job do you drive a truck up and down US 1, the blue ocean on both sides, park beside the ocean, open the doors, and people come in and check out books. It was just a wonderful job. And also it allowed me to I was young enough where I had the energy to still go home after work and play in my darkroom. So I continued to work throughout all those times. And say what went on during that period in the 70s and 80s, there was a phenomenon that was taking place where publishers were setting aside part of their time to publish what was called artist books. And artist books were pop-up books. They were books that dealt with graphics that dealt with politics, gender identity. It was the gamut of books. And one of these presses in 1985 held a competition. I entered this competition and ended up winning it.
Before we get that, we have one more slide here, which is kind of crucial. You had the bookmobile.
The bookmobile, and that man was Walter, who was the driver in the beginning few years, and we were quite the pair.
And I shut off my laptop. Yay, technical difficulties. You got any idea what's going on with this? No? Oh, wait, all right. We're okay, we got it.
See all your email. Let's read your email.
Yeah, I'm not really organized on my computer, just to be clear about that. So before we get into books, let's talk a little bit about cameras, because when you first moved down here, you said was when you first started experimenting with different types of cameras.
So in 1978, which was really the first year I had started the bookmobile, I also had subscribed to some book club where once a month I got a book on photography. It arrived in the mail. And one month a book arrived that was on an exhibition that Friends of Photography in San Francisco had published with artists working with this camera called a Diana. The Diana was manufactured in Hong Kong in the early 60s and was sold in toy stores. And in the mid-60s, some professor in Ohio State University started issuing them to their beginning photography students to introduce them to the basics of photography. Its redeeming factor was it was plastic, it had a plastic lens, and it used a medium format film. This plastic lens gave a soft focus image. And when I saw this book, it was really the first time I felt like I could use this tool to help me find my voice. And down here, this was like 78, so there was a flea market here. And at that point, I think you could only find them in flea markets. So I found one and continued to find them because they had a tendency to break. They're plastic. So.
Okay, and then from there, so you were shooting the Diana camera and you entered this contest for the book?
Yeah, so in '85 there was this competition. I won a stipend of money, and I had about 8 months to make the book. And then there was a residency program that came with the competition where I went to Atlanta, Georgia for, I can't remember the period of time, if it was a month or longer, to make the book. I did all the mechanicals doing the book to make the litho plates. It was back before computers when that's how books were done. And it's kind of interesting because now in the photography world, there's a phenomenon where if you're an artist, photography books are one of the ways you can get your work to be seen. And there's a lot of exciting stuff being done. It's digital, it's easy to do, it's fast. I mean, I think about how long it took me to produce this one book. But it's a phenomenon that's happening now. It's a good way to show your work.
Might be a premature question, but do you think the slowness of the process produces different work? I mean, as opposed to now where everything is relatively instantaneous, and you can produce a book in an afternoon if you want to, in theory.
If you want to,
Is that a qualification you're comfortable with?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that it depends upon the artist. I mean, there was pop-up books. A pop-up book is still going to take someone a longer length of time. But yes, before computers, everything took a long time.
So what do you mean
Digital
by,
photography changed everything.
What do you mean by pop-up book, by the way?
Well, you know, a pop-up book, there's, in fact, I watched one being made in the old, and I think it must be still the same, where machines will cut out portions of the book, and you know, you open the pages and things pop out.
Cool. All right, so you want to talk about the book a little bit?
Yes, all right.
So that's the cover right there.
So this book came about, the bookmobile lent itself to me in this way. Part of my job on the bookmobile was once a week to change out some of the books, to rotate the books. And I would go through the stacks of the Key West Library, choosing different books, which gave me the afternoon to just roam the stacks. And back then they had a great collection of 1930s to 50s adventure books, you know, Eskimos, anything. And they had a lot in the Caribbean. And there was some books that, like William Seabrook, Magic Island, this Englishman went off to Haiti and got in with the voodoo people. And more important, it was a woman named Nora Zeal Hurston, who I read her a memoir that she had read. And she was a woman who had been given grant money to go to Haiti and the Caribbean. She was interested in music and myth. And in her autobiography, there was one paragraph where she described the myth side of the making of a zombie. And within that one paragraph, I could grab a hold of certain sentences I could grab the imagery. And from that paragraph, I did this book, Fierce Power, Bad Fate, and it was the making of a zombie.
And this is the cover of it. And then this would be your title page right here. And you shot this in a mix of places?
It was mostly here in Key West and up the Keys. There was in Miami a little bit. There was a lot more visible evidence of down here. I guess it was what's it called? I forget. You know, I've forgotten what some of the stuff is. But the Cuban influences were down.
The Santeria stuff?
You'd go to the cemetery and there were bricks that were wrapped in tin foil. I actually found on the side of the road several times sort of juju bags, you know, that would have chicken legs in them and weird stuff. There was a lot of that down here back then.
I remember actually when I first moved here, one of the stories in the Citizen was about a cow tongue that was left on the courthouse steps, split open with the judge's name in it. And so that kind of stuff used to be more common.
Yeah.
And that kind of integrated into your...
Yes.
Okay, so we'll go through a couple of these images.
But like this picture was on Rockland Key, and there was...
Is that the Walters compound?
I don't know, let's see, his name was Whitey. I wrote down this black man, and he had an entire environment set up at his house, and walls were painted in polka dots. He had this whole sort of little world. He had barber shops, he had bedrooms, he had this whole world sort of set up for what? I'm not sure. But this was outside of his house.
Okay. And that one, is that?
Actually, that was in Jamaica. I was, when you could fly there round trip, $79. I think I went there once.
So did you shoot this with the intention of building the narrative? Or was this stuff that you kind of built it around afterwards?
I was making the book during this period of time, but actually most of it was found imagery that I put together. And my original thoughts were the book were going to be without words. There was Max Ernst did these incredible books, and one of them was there were these surrealist novels that made no sense, but there were no words to them. And of course, I wanted to be Max Ernst, and I tried doing this, and it didn't work, so I had to add text to this whole book to make it make sense. And I really there was two images that I set up. The man sitting on the horse.
Is that this next one?
Yeah, I had a girlfriend who had a horse on Cudjoe Key, and I had a friend, I dragged a friend up there and made him sit on the horse backwards, because that's part of the story.
Cool.
And there was one other image that I set up.
Okay, that wasn't it. No.
No.
Okay. And so you essentially camped out for a month and put this book together, and
No, it was many months that I did that. And then I had the book all together, and then when I went to Atlanta, that's where all the mechanicals of it started.
okay. And this was kind of the end of the bookmobile days.
Yeah, I quit the bookmobile. My life was just really ready for change. I quit the bookmobile and did the residency in Atlanta and came back and was sort of a handy girl for.
Right. So you started an art creating business, and so you were basically, it was when you started to take control of your schedule as an artist. You mean?
Sort of, but you got to work really hard to keep a roof over your head.
Yeah.
So.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, and you also, we're going to move into this next section. Oh, that's one of the last images from Fierce Power, Bad Fate.
Those are just a few pages on it.
And then you said this is when you started going over to Europe, and
So in the 90s, I had the opportunity to go to France, and that was another big sort of moment in my life. I started photographing in museums and making larger prints and exhibiting.
and what type of prints were they? Yeah.
Silver prints.
Okay.
These are traditional silver prints, and they were printed on 20 by 24 papers, so that was big for me, and that was a big change. So it was, I think, working in museums, and then I started going to Europe every year. It was a part of my life. I go over there with John Martini. We share a home and a studio space there.
And you started shooting in museums then? Is that?
I started shooting in museums, and I wasn't documenting pieces. I was trying to interpret them, I guess. I think we oftentimes, I'm sort of more of an intuitive person. I just sort of go after things I'm interested in, and then I reason it out afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
But the limitations of working in museums, in the beginning, a lot of this large sculpture, if you want to show some of them, were not behind glass. So I could get up close to the pieces.
And was some of this surreptitious, or was this all
No, I was definitely on a path of looking, I think I probably made one photograph of a sculpture that I liked, and then it became an obsession for a few years.
Okay. And so you were talking about how this is a little bit of a travelogue for you, right? Is there,
Yeah, well, so John and I would spend many months in France, and vacations were always designated by what my obsession was and what I needed to photograph and where to go. These were mostly done in France or in New York.
Yeah, at this point you started shooting more over in Europe. Most of your images are created over in Europe, right? And
Yes.
My understanding of your process is what you work to do now is you shoot over there and then you tend to print over here. Is that correct, or is that?
Yes, I have a darkroom there and print
Okay.
there, but most of my imagery is from France
Okay.
and Europe.
And these are all the silver prints from that era.
Yeah.
Okay. And we kind of put this
That
one.
was from Greece. I did a whole series on Greece. I think we ended with that one because it's a little bit of a transition piece to working with smaller images.
Mm-hmm.
I think then I started working with Etruscan archaeological pieces, and they were behind glass, and I liked the limitations of that. Curatorial work was always something that I would either love a curator or hate him, by where he would put if he would put labels in front of pieces that I didn't want there, or whatever.
And this is before Photoshop, so you could just take that stuff out.
I don't. Yeah, I'm film. I don't.
No, you're full on analog. There's.
Yeah, no, I just work with film. I don't work with digital at all.
Okay. So this is the era after that. So after you started shooting a lot of those kind of more romantic figures, then you started shooting more kind of Middle Eastern figures, correct?
Yeah, so though a lot of the Middle Eastern stuff, I didn't go to the Middle East. It was haunting the halls of the Louvre mostly, I would say.
Okay. And so these are a couple from that period of time. But you're also getting kind of more abstract, less figurative, in my understanding, in my English major's understanding of the art world.
I guess. I don't think of them as abstract. I was just trying to get an effect that I liked.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could analyze it afterwards, but that's an afterwards.
Right, but I mean, this is kind of when you, like, all right, we had this conversation once where you once said that blurry is great, but it's got to be blurry in the right way.
Well, that's very true. I mean, so I use this camera, and there's a focus point to it. It's always soft. It's got soft edges. The edges begin to disappear, and I oftentimes work out of the range of what the lens is supposed to do. But there's this trick to working out of its range and having it be out of focus in the right way, because if it's out of focus in the wrong way, it doesn't work.
Right. And nobody understands what the right wrong of that is, but you, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. But this is kind of like, I mean, in my mind, if you're writing the monograph on your work, it's like, this is when you went blurry. Which, I mean, that's not in any way derogatory thing. That's
It probably has to do with my eyesight.
It's when you embrace the blur. So we'll move on to that. Did you ever move a statue because you thought it would work better composition-wise?
You don't touch those things in the Louvre.
I mean, you don't touch them if you don't get caught.
No.
All right, and these are a couple of Etruscan figures, which...
And we had some great times in Italy. This is before computers, and John and I just, for several years, went around just with a guidebook and searched out any archaeological museum that was in the book, and would perhaps drive for a day to get to an archaeological museum, and sometimes found nothing. But it was a wonderful way to travel, and found some great museums, all things. But one time what was I interested in? I read an article, I don't know, in the Sunday supplement to some French newspaper, and it was all about this new museum that had just opened in the Dordogne region, and it was illustrated with all of these great figurative objects, these Venuses, just wonderful stuff, and it was like, all right, we gotta go there. So we planned this whole trip, we go down there, and I didn't, maybe my French was not so good, but it was illustrated with, so we went there, and this museum was 3 floors of rocks. There was one figurative object in the museum, and I just didn't read the article close enough. All the figurative pieces had been like moved in the 60s back to Paris or whatever to be protected. So it was a museum of rocks.
I did that to my wife once. We went to Amsterdam, we went to a hotel, and I looked at the time out gown, it said a really nice hotel, and I didn't really flip the page to where it said in the red light district. So, I mean, I've been there is what I'm saying. But the Etruscans are kind of a mysterious people, right? Is that...
Yes, they don't know a lot about them.
Okay.
None of that did I really...
Tell me about the mysterious people that nobody knows anything about.
I really didn't care about that. I mean, for me, I'm sure I took one image of a small object and found it interesting, and then just headed for any archaeological museum that had Etruscan work in it. All through Tuscany. It was just some beautiful work.
Sounds like a fun mission to be on. And then, okay, so this is, after that is you went through, you started shooting basically vessels. You got almost into more geometric work, I would call it.
Well, right
here. Go back one, or?
No, well, right here, so let's see. So John and I every year spend many months in France, and one year John became interested in making monoprints. He bought a gravure press, and started making monoprints. And I saw this tool and I thought, what can I do with this? And I discovered the process of photogravure. Photogravure is it's an intaglio process, which means the image below the surface is printed. And it's a 19th century process that in like 1839, two men, one in England, one in France, started working separately on this process. And it was patented in 1852, and I thought that this process would add one more step between the negative and my work. My work has, I hope, a mysterious side to it. People, when you look at it, you aren't quite sure what's going on. And I thought that this would add one more element to that. It's a process where I start off with a negative, and through about 6 or 7 steps, you end up etching a copper plate. You then print the image on a gravure press with etching inks. And those etching inks add sort of it's a different look. I mean, the process is a reproductive process, but you can fool with things. And like any process, unknown things happen when you do it.
So, I mean, you figured this whole process out immediately, right? No, okay.
So this is pre-computer when I started doing it, and I had one book in my library on printmaking techniques. And it was, so this from this one chapter, I read about it, and there was a bibliography, and there was a source materials in this book, where to get potassium dichromate, where do you get gelatin tissue. I mean, these were exotic products to me. And it's a difficult process, and it from this one book, and there was a couple of pages in another book, but there wasn't a whole lot out there at this point, and there wasn't a whole lot of places I could figure out where to find out about it. So I, in essence, started teaching myself, and it was not going well. Nothing was going along how it was supposed to. It's a process where you sensitize a resist, a gelatin tissue, that rests, and then the next day you, through another process, apply it to a copper plate. It's sort of a complicated process, and you have to have a controlled environment, which I didn't realize in the beginning. But things weren't going right, and I got very frustrated one day and somehow got a hold of the telephone number for graphic studios in Tampa, Florida, where this man, I don't know how to pronounce his name right, Deli Scocciato, was a master printmaker and head of one of the departments there. So I called up on the phone and I just sort of said, is Mr. Scocciato around? And the woman at the desk said, oh, he's walking past right now, let me grab him. So I had this great conversation with this man, and in the middle of the conversation, he sort of said, well, you know, there was a printing error in this book, in one of the formulas. And I sort of went, there was a dead silence for a while, and I said, no, I didn't know this. So after I corrected the sensitizing the gelatin tissue formula, things went a little better.
Let's look through a few of these images. And this is actually an interesting one, because this is your first time you ever composited something, right?
This was, which was quite a few years after I was doing the process. It's a difficult process, and I still struggle with it, but it's such a beautiful process that I'm sort of hooked. I don't do silver printing anymore. I find it sort of boring. there's something about this whole process that just sort of keeps me out of trouble and locked in a dark room for days on end.
Well, I mean, this is kind of one of my obsessions about your work is, you shoot with a dynamic camera, which is by its nature cranky and irregular and not a precise instrument, and then you print on this press that, isn't exactly, forgiving or easy to understand and all this kind of stuff. And whenever I talk to you, you're like, yeah, it's not going right. And I'm like, there's no way it can go right. But it does.
There are masters who make it go right. I'm not quite in that category, but
yeah, I mean, you find your way through this process to get what you want. You have this.
Yeah.
I mean, I
think that's the attraction in many ways.
Okay.
Is the process. I mean, you have paper that you have to figure out which paper you want to use. There's inks, and you use this ink to make contrast, or that ink to do this. It's just a real hands-on process. It's very sensual. With the press, you have a big wheel that you pull through. There's just many steps to it that add to the end effect.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, let's talk about this a little bit. I mean, I was reading this Jamaica Kincaid book the other day, and she's talking about her garden and what's in her mind's eye and how the garden, trying to get the garden to that point. And you always seem to be working towards a very specific idea. I mean, how visually specific is that in your head? Is it kind of like you stop finding objections, or that you actually get to this end point of what you're looking for?
I do have an idea about what I want the image to look like, and I can pretty much get there. But there's from the negative, you start out with a negative, and you have an idea what that will look like. And along the way, in the process, it's a very controlled process. You can't really break the rules, but you can fudge with them a little bit. And the same thing for the printing process. And things happen. I'm not a purist, but I could take and scratch the image on purpose. I sort of like how things unfold on their own, and scratches will happen. Scratches will happen in the gelatin or on the plate, and I sort of like that process, sort of it happening on its own more than controlling it, though I am supposed to be the chef. Make it do what I want it to do. It's not always the case.
And these images up here, tell me a little, what are you shooting in this series?
Well, for this series I became sort of obsessed with the painter Morandi. I think my influences come now more from, not from photography, but from painters and sculptors, I would say. And even though when John and I we're traveling around, Bologna has this wonderful archaeological museum, one of my favorites, that has this great Etruscan collection. But in the town of Bologna also there's a museum and the studio space of Giorgio Morandi, who is an Italian modernist painter. And we saw his work there, and it was like, oh yeah, it's okay. And I think a couple of years later at the Metropolitan, I was there and there was a retrospective of his work, and I fell in love. I sort of wanted to be Giorgio Morandi, and started photographing vessels wherever we went. Then, we had to go to places. Amsterdam has an incredible collection of these pieces are from Berlin. But in Amsterdam, there's an incredible collection of glass that's Etruscan and from early Greek work. This is early Greek from the Louvre. It's a very tiny piece, just like the vase is maybe 3 inches big, but you don't know that from the image.
Right. And at some point, there was basically a town you went to. Have we got to any of those images yet? We're talking to where the mayor ended up doing a.
Oh no.
Are we in the right zone for that?
You have to get to the last image.
Okay, we're going to go to the last image then.
Which is that one?
All right, we're at the last image.
So I was obsessed with vessels, and I felt like I could just keep taking pictures of vessels one after the next. Just I think just sort of seeing how far you can take it. And one year I was offered a show in Beaumont, France, and it's next to Clermont-Ferrand, which is a big city. This region in France is famous for Gallo-Roman pottery, and Beaumont is in that whole region. Beaumont was too small to have its own archaeological museum, but anytime a road was built or somebody dug something and an object was dug up, it was brought over to Clermont-Ferrand and put in their overstock, as all museums have. So one of the lures for going to this, having a show in Beaumont, was the mayor sort of said, well, you can come to Beaumont and I can get you into the back rooms of the archaeological museums and you can photograph anything that belongs to Beaumont. So went to this warehouse, and John, myself, and the registrar for the museum would just come down with these big crates of anything. She had a list of what belonged to Beaumont, and we would look inside these crates, and sometimes it was just shards of pottery and sometimes whole vessels. She'd pull them out and put them on the table, and she said, well, here they are, do what you want with them. So, it was like I was picking up these 12th century pieces of pottery and could arrange them any way I wanted, and it was sort of shocking to be able to touch these. I was totally unprepared and had to scramble and find cardboard to place over a card table and
you had like 17 assistants and all that going on, right?
So no,
so this is all natural. Everything you shoot is
I
pretty
shoot
much
just
natural
lighting, whatever is available. And natural lighting when you're in a dark room, the camera also has this tendency to focus light to the center. And also when you're in a dark room, you control light by just holding your hand in front of the enlarger so light, it's natural lighting, and I help create some of the effects.
Okay.
But after being in this warehouse with these pieces and arranging them, this is not a Morandi arrangement, but it's that being able to arrange those sort of ended, and that was really not behind glass, so that was sort of the first time for vessels not being behind glass, and that sort of ended that phase.
Okay.
I gave up vessels.
All right, this is my question, which is it's actually right there. So how do you know when you're done with something? How do you know when you've worked that vein long enough, when it's time to, move on to the next thing, if there is a next thing?
I think, I sort of gauge my work by every year you take a step. If I'm working with in the same vein, it's another step where the work will change a little bit. But for a major change, I don't know, maybe you're forced into it. I wasn't forced into it, but it was sort of like, all right, this is it. And then I had a year of literally artist freak out. What was I going to do next? I spent a year sort of doing this and that and not really finding something till sort of the next step, which maybe we'll move to that, which was...
mostly found objects, I guess we'd call them?
Yeah, so the next step was I sort of really gave up working in museums, and John had started collecting these wooden sort of folk sculptures in flea markets in France, and they were anonymously carved wooden sculptures that just were filled with soul. And I started placing them in front of white paper in the studio and photographing that, not sort of knowing what I was going to do with them. This is a shoe. Now, why was this carved? Heaven only knows. And this is part of the process of between the camera and the process of photogravure. This almost doesn't look like a photograph. It looks very much like a drawing. And that's where that the inks and the soft edge really helps make that happen. This was not a wooden, and so of course in the flea market you sort of collect things, and I did photograph a lot of wooden things and started to expand this. I mean, this was a house I think that they do for miniature train sets.
Okay, was this before or after Hurricane Wilma?
I can't remember.
Okay. Well, I mean,
I think that's after Wilma. No,
is it after? I mean,
this
because
is definitely after Wilma.
in Hurricane Wilma, you essentially lost your dark room in your house and kind of got knocked back on your pins a little bit. For the first time. Until this year. Yay. But I mean, is that part of your process? Were you thinking about that in this image, or is that just kind of
No,
something?
actually, this one came from, there's another image, let's see, maybe it's the next one. So this is one of these wooden anonymously carved objects, and they're just the sweetest items. And I had this image, and I liked it. And there's a part of me that does think in terms of stories. And I had him running, and it was sort of like, he's running, what's he running from? And that's when I turned that little house upside down. You know, something was going on there.
Okay, I mean, I guess yeah, all right. I'm trying to figure out, like, are you aiming at meaning on this, or is this just something you find? Like, is this a resonance you find, or something you're trying to bring about? I mean, you could have put the house straight up.
Yeah, but then.
So there's a decision there.
So there's definitely a decision. I mean, also you try different things. I have images of that house, right side up. You turn I turned it upside down, and maybe, like I said, I'm intuitive. You photograph different things, and you do it in a certain way, and out of everything you photograph doesn't come an image that you keep. So I think there's a collection of ways that happens. I do look for things.
Mm-hmm. Are they specific things, or are they kind of?
No,
I mean, how do I say this?
Yeah.
I'm kind of failing at this question, but it's like, you're like, I want to do something about domestic life or whatever. You're just like, let's work with the house until we find something that.
I think the objects come to me. We go to these flea markets every Sunday, and like I said, I almost like the idea of things coming to me rather than me going after them. But I do I just search for things. I don't buy a lot of things. Which is probably not good, but I sort of like the idea of things coming to me more.
Okay. And then, so after that period, when you figured you were at the end of something, you banged your head on the table for another year, or because you got into composites after that? It's next year.
Yeah, from this, I started. Let's see. So I'm photographing things with a white background, and I don't know how I thought of wallpaper, but I started photographing wallpaper and putting that behind these objects. I also started adding color to some of the images, and there is a process with photogravure that's way too complicated, and I would actually have to get start shooting with color film and get a computer, and like lithography, you have to take the image apart for photogravure and have separate plates for each color.
Mm-hmm.
Then you put it back together. That's way too complicated. This black and white is complicated enough. So I've started adding color just with etching inks to the final print.
Okay. And do you feel like you're trying to build narratives here, or?
I don't know. I photographed something and I had to figure out what to do with it. I like narratives. I think things just come about. A lot of it unconsciously, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I liked wallpaper, so I have wallpaper and then what do you do with it?
Okay. And there's another one. Is that in the same series?
Yes, that
Okay.
is.
Now, I mean, these are kind of arrangements, right? You're not doing composites here. These are more physically arranged. Might demystify your process too
No,
much?
those are very much just images. I think, let's see, I can't remember if that's 3 different negatives.
Okay, so that is built in darkroom.
Most of them, I'm beginning to make an image more than photograph the image. I think the activity of making it is what is attractive to me. So that image is 3 separate negatives. And it's fun, you know, that one, I mean, I started out with the woman in the beginning, and you start off with her, and then it's what's next, and why I put that head upside down in the corner, I sort of really don't know, other than the image needed something, and then it needed something more, and I put that wedge of wallpaper in there. I like that in the dark room, it's sort of this fun thing where I go in there and I start off with one object and it leads somewhere. And I don't know where it's going to lead really, ever. That was the same way. I mean, I started off, there's the 3 sculptures I did put together. And actually there's an artist, Maholi Naj, who had influenced this body of work. I think this is the only one where you're a little bit aware of that, where he did a lot of poster work. He was a Hungarian who was part of the Bauhaus, who came to the United States, and he was actually, when I went to Columbia College, he was somebody that was really promoted, maybe because of the Chicago area and the Bauhaus. But I looked back at his work, and it was very much an influence for this body of work.
And then, this is pretty recent, isn't it? Or is this?
No, that's from a few years ago, and that's kind of got a good story to it. I started off with that head in the center, and it's such a sweet head. I mean, it has such soul. They're like folk art, these pieces, outsider art. And I had her, and I had this wooden hand, and I put the wooden hand up there, and these other images I repetitively put on, which is not easy in this process at all, and drew the lines on there. It was really kind of, this image is sort of a personal blessing to myself, because I was going through a real anxious time and just needed a blessing.
So I think that might be our last one, actually.
Is that it? For images?
Hold on.
Maybe so.
I totally know how to use this machine. Can we go through it all fast again?
Yeah, it is there.
Yeah, I think that's our last image. Okay, so I think talking to you lately, you feel like you're at the end of this kind of period of work, and are you casting about again, or is there something you're working, or?
Well, this has been a difficult year, as we all know.
I mean, yeah, you should say Carol's house.
I live on Sugarloaf, and my house was slapped by Irma again. So I was continuing in France with this work, and I was continuing to photograph pieces with the idea of putting them together to tell more of a story. I think I was working towards more of each image actually having a complete story in it. And that was sort of interrupted by coming back in September and having to rebuild my darkroom and find new equipment. And I am back to work, but I'm not so happy with what I was doing, which might mean that I am at the end of this body of work. I almost feel like I've taken it too far, where the mystery is not quite there, that it's too much, maybe manipulated, but I'm not sure. I only have these things to work with, and so I'm sort of just now working. We'll see what happens, but I'm a little frustrated, which is the name of the game when you're an artist, I think, sometimes.
This will be my last pain in the butt question for the night, which is, does your happiness matter while you're working on this? If you're unhappy with the work, does that mean it's bad work? Do you know?
No.
I mean, have you ever come out of stuff where you felt miserable about it and then ultimately you realize it's okay or it's good even? Or how good of a barometer are you judging it in the process?
I think I'm pretty good with that. I mean, I'm happy in the darkroom, even when things don't go well, and if the image is not one that I like, I'm happy doing it most of the time. It's hard because now I'm not liking anything, so I'm unhappy, so does that mean the change is about to happen? I don't know.
Okay, we'll find out soon, I hope.
So.
Okay, well, we're going to open this up for questions. Thanks for talking to me. If you have a question, you can just wave to Emily, and please use the microphone so that people can hear you. Got one over there, got a couple over there.
Kara, you said you thought maybe you might be over-manipulated. Could you explain that?
Let me repeat the question quick, because so everyone else can hear. Is that he said you're worried? He's asking about whether you feel you're over manipulating things.
Well, this is a body of work that nobody has seen, me included. In France, I was working with film because actually the press that we have there until this year didn't have enough pressure for the photogravure process. It takes a lot of pressure to print. So I could print plates there, but they would, it was not a good enough, I couldn't get enough pressure to get a good print. So I was working with film there and putting together images, and I don't know, the last images that you saw that were composites, I feel that there's a mystery to them, like what's going on, what's that? There's no line of story. I guess what I'm afraid of is that I'm doing now is maybe illustration. I don't think any of my work is down the line of illustration so much, but I'm a little worried about what I was thinking about doing is an illustration of a thought. I'm more interested in emotional reaction to my work and people sort of not quite knowing what's going on.
Can you hear me? Yes. So, as a person who also spends time in France and Key West, I'm particularly intrigued by the thought that you photograph in France and you do the creative process in the darkroom in Key West. And I just wondered if you'd comment on that.
Well, let's see, in France I have a darkroom, and photogravure is a contact process. So when I start with a negative, I have to go to something what's called a film positive. That film positive has to be the same size as the image. So if I'm working with a 16 by 16 inch image, the film is pretty big. And this film that I work with, it's, to make it's like 6 minutes in the developer just to take a test strip. And it's a long process getting to the end of a finished piece of film, for me at least. In the process, you're the film, the density of the blacks have to be there's a mathematical formula between the highlights and the densities of the blacks. If the density of the black is too high, in the etching process, the blacks will sort of explode and you get a hole in the image. So I do a big portion of the creative process in France. Up until now, I really had stopped trying to print there because I'm working with imagery that's just too big for our press there. But we did end up getting a used press in Italy that is just a beauty. And I'm looking forward to working on that when we return. But there's a time, everything takes a long time, so between France and then coming here, I will say that with this last body of work, a lot of that going into the darkroom and putting images together had changed from what I was doing in France. I mean, there's just a time period where you do this, then I get into the darkroom and start doing something again, and I've sort of changed my mind about something. And so it's a combination between the two places that I really feel that the creative end is.
We got one back there.
Well, first, it's been a wonderful presentation. The images are fabulous. I've been a fan of your work for years, Carol. I love the mystery, the through a glass darkly. But I would like to comment that, acknowledging that Mark is also a wonderful photographer, it's been fascinating listening to the two of you because I think Mark thinks more in words and you think, Carol, more in pictures. Is that correct?
There's a strong argument that I don't really think.
I don't know, because I know Mark's imagery, and Mark also, so this camera that I use, the Diana, it was developed in the 60s, the patent ran out in the 70s, where then you could just find them in flea markets. In the, maybe it was in the 90s that a group of people bought the patent and started remanufacturing this Diana because it really became a cult camera. And now you can buy a Diana camera. And now you can also buy attachments. The lens, you can put this plastic lens onto a sophisticated 35 millimeter camera, which is what Mark has done, and it's created some great images just using the plastic lens.
I think part of it is I'm a lot lazier than Carol, but it's also I'm impatient, and I don't have the space for a dark room, and I can't see myself building one at this point. So I do like digital photography, but I'm kind of obsessed on the hybrids between the two.
Yeah.
The kids now, the darn kids out there now, they're shooting what's called lomography, which is Holga cameras, Diana cameras, all these kind of cheap things, usually made in China. And so you can shoot a hybrid now, and it's funny, there's a whole school of these kids out there who think they invented this, and Carol's been doing this for 30 years, which I'm just I think that's great. She was lomography Lomo when Lomo wasn't cool. That's kind of cool. Do you have another question out there, or a guy in the blue shirt? Or Emily? Sorry. We're making Emily run around the room.
So Carol, if I recall correctly, and I may be wrong on this history, Matthew Brady was commissioned to take photogravure shots of the battlefields in the Civil War. Is that what he used to create the first photographs that appeared in Harper's Weekly?
I don't know.
Well, it was the only photographic process at the time.
I don't know. I really don't know about Matthew
I actually
Brady.
think Brady might have been a salt print photographer,
Yeah,
which is an older process but less expensive and less precise.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but it seems like I would know if Edward Curtis, all those Indian, those portfolios were all photogravure.
Well, in any event, the point of my question is not that. The point of the question was that was a period when a seized image was then transferred to a publication so that it could be broadcast as news.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's rotogravure, which is a total separate creature. Rotogravure is sort of like not the stepchild, but it's a much inferior process. Like Alfred Stieglitz back in the early 1900s had a very famous magazine called Camera Works, and all of the imagery in Camera Works were hand pulled from flat plates. So rotogravure is on a cylinder and photogravure is on a plate. Each image has to be hand pulled. And so in Camera Works, all of the imagery was photogravure.
Well, what's interesting is that you use processes that were created in that era, and the power of those processes was to bring an actual image, not an artist's impression of the image, but the actual image from the battlefields or from the Western Indian, Native American settlements to the broad public through the news media. That's the first time that it happened. It happened in France, and then that's when it first came to America. And what you have done is you've taken those methodologies, those historically very first methodologies for reproducing an actual image, and you've taken that and you've decided to use it for creative purposes rather than capturing reality. You've done the opposite of what was done with those capabilities when they were first developed.
Originally, the process was a reproductive process, but early on there were some photographers who worked with it to be the original product, they didn't start off with a photographic print and then transfer it. The whole idea was to have it be a photogravure. Because it's a very beautiful process. With the process you can there's a wider range from black to whites that you can even get with any silver printing. But there have been artists who have worked with it exclusively.
All right, I think we're good for that. Thanks everyone for coming out.